Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, uh, in my view, we are in the midst of one of the biggest disruptions that is likely to take place in the world, and that is the move towards transportation and mobility as a service rather than as a mere ownership. And this is going to happen simply because two major things are going to happen. One, that the cost of battery, which was at one point of time about $1,100 per kilowatt hour, is falling very rapidly and has come down to about $176 per kilowatt hour. But I envisage that in 3 years' time, the cost of battery will be about close to $76 per kilowatt hour. And at that point, the EV vehicles will be much cheaper than combustion vehicles. And this is just 3 years away. And it's not just the total cost of ownership, but the initial cost of ownership will become cheaper than combustion vehicles. And this would really mean that we would have moved from 2,000 parts in a combustion vehicle to just 20 parts in an EV vehicle. That's number one. Number two, to my mind, the biggest transformation that is going to take place across the world and the biggest disruption that will take place will be in the very rapid fall of storage of battery. And this will be in an extremely decentralized manner, but the cost of storage would have fallen very rapidly in the next decade. And that would imply that much of the power across the world will be not fossil-based power, but would be renewable power, which would be then stored at very cheap cost and would enable all of us to have then moved away towards rooftop solar stored in individual households, which would then be able to charge individual vehicles through the solar in a decentralized manner. So what you are heading for is a decarbonized world, a digitized world, and a very, very decentralized future. And quite often in India, we get into sunset areas of industries. We always get into the sunset areas of industries, and therefore it becomes very difficult to penetrate global markets. But let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that this is going to be the sunrise area of industry. And this will be one of the biggest disruptions that will take place. And this will take place simply because, and it's important to understand this, that India's crude oil demand was nearly about 211 million tons in 2019. And out of the total demand, nearly 84% was imported. And the import of crude oil, the cost for that for the country, that is the cost for India, was in rupee terms about 7,000 billion to the exchequer. And that's almost about one-fourth of the total imports of the country. So one-fourth of the total imports of country was the import of crude oil, costing nearly 7,000 billion in rupee terms to the exchequer, and 70% of diesel and almost 99.6% of petrol is consumed by the transport sector. So 70% of the diesel and 99.6% of the petrol is consumed by the transport sector, and therefore, to my mind, it is inevitable that we shift to cleaner sources of energy. And with this disruption, it's important to understand that what will happen as a consequence of this that there will be a huge shift towards, it's not merely a shift from 2,000 to 20 parts, but it will be a shift towards IT, electronics, which will be in vehicles as much as about 50%. And the nature of jobs would change. The nature of jobs would totally change. The ecosystem as a whole, which would grow, and in totality, electronic revolution would be a huge job creator. or there will be a huge automation in all this. And why I'm saying this is, it's important to understand that almost in India today, 80%, we are very different from the rest of the world. You know, the rest of the world, I mean, if you look at the United States of America, almost, you know, they have about close to, you know, the vehicle penetration is very, very high, extremely high. So everybody has about 3 to 4 vehicles. But in India, the vehicle four-wheeler penetration is still very, very low. Very low. But in India, 82% of the vehicles are two-wheelers. And last year, for instance, 82% of the vehicles sold in India were two-wheelers, which can actually be charged at home. And there will be innovative charging models like battery swapping, which would coexist with traditional charging at home, traditional charging at office, besides public charging stations. And with this fall in the cost of battery, even now, today, for instance, the cost of three-wheelers, the initial cost of three-wheelers and the total cost of ownership of three-wheelers is actually cheaper than the combustion vehicle. So if you look at last year, for instance, India sold nearly 7.69 lakh electric vehicles in financial year 2019. And out of these, nearly 6.3 lakhs were electric three-wheelers. So nobody is buying combustion electric three-wheeler. Everybody has switched over to electric three-wheeler with lithium ion. And that's important to understand. And my assessment is that in the next 2 years, the initial cost of two-wheelers will be lower than the initial cost of a two-wheeler combustion vehicle. You know, some time back, we had said that actually by 2026, every vehicle, two-wheeler vehicle to be driven in India should be a two-wheeler. The reason for saying that, we were debating this, and the reason for saying that in the Committee of Secretaries was that we should get the size and scale. Because if you do not get the size and scale, in India, the automobile industry accounts for almost 50% of the manufacturing. 50% of the manufacturing is automobile. And out of that 50% of that, imagine the extent of two-wheelers. So if you are not able to, if you lose the manufacturing of automobiles in India, you would have lost almost 40 lakh jobs in India. So therefore, we said, if you do not get the size and scale, you will constantly remain an importer of vehicles, particularly from China. All along, you will remain an importer of vehicles. So we said that if you want to create size and scale, there are only two ways you can do this. Only two ways you can do this. Either you play around with CAFE norms and push the norms higher, and you say that polluter must pay, and therefore, because the consumers are suffering, the polluter must pay and keep enhancing the CAFE norms. Or secondly, you say that by such and such date, mandatorily you say that you want to improve the quality of life of the citizens of Delhi, and therefore the Delhi roads must be all two-wheelers. When we said this, this was a tentative discussion, but when it came out, the industry started revolting. I mean, they said that this is not feasible, this is not possible, this is not doable. And they said that we'll actually spell out a roadmap, and we'll get a study done. So we said, okay, get the study done in 3 months' time or 4 months' time. They said, we'll give you a study in 4 months' time. It's been a year, they've not done this study. This is the Indian industry. But let me tell you, what they did as a consequence of that, and the industry within the two-wheelers was highly divided, because one side were the startups who were already disrupting. So you had Ather Energy, you had Okinawa, you had many other startups. This Micromax guy, they had already moved into the electric world. And the established player realized this, that if they do not become a part of this, the startup, and this is what happened in China, that the startup world disrupted the existing players, and the startup world actually moved far ahead. So what did they do? Hero started investing in Ather. A company like Bharat Forge invested 500 crores in another company for on the EV side, it invested in another company in UK, and they realized that actually the disruption is happening at such a rapid pace that if they do not invest in two-wheelers, they lose market size and scale, and therefore they started investing. And the established players who objected to this, within 3 months, Bajaj launched its two-wheeler scooter. It's Chetak, which it had done away with in the scooter world. Within 3 months of us saying this, launched the Bajaj Chetak in Delhi. And just last week, TVS launched its electric scooter, all priced at between 1 lakh to 1,15,000. And therefore, what is happening as a consequence of this? Government did only 2 things. The first thing government did was that it brought down the GST on EVs to 5%, and on combustion vehicles, it kept the GST at 28%. So it created a differentiation. And on hybrid, it's even higher. It's almost about 48%. So between the GST, between EV and between combustion, there's a difference of almost 23%. The second thing the government did was that it said it'll give a tax exemption of up to 1.5 lakhs on the interest component of the vehicle procured if it's an electric vehicle. So it made economic sense for people to push ahead with EV because the variable cost was very, very low. There was virtually no variable cost. But I envisage that in the next 2 to 2.5 years, even that will go down, and the initial cost of two-wheeler will be lower because the cost of battery would have fallen, and you could charge at homes. But the challenge really for me in Indian context, and this is very important, is that as you move towards a shared, connected, and a zero-emission world, it'll be a shared, connected, and a zero-emission world. It's very important as the cost of battery falls that we charge the battery with clean power and not fossil power. And this is really the challenge for India. And this challenge for India is really about pushing battery storage. If there's a huge opportunity for India because to get the size and scale, and that is what we are pushing for, is that the initial bit of battery storage, and this is going to be the most disruptive thing in the world, that India must create size and scale of battery storage to enable cost of battery to fall in India. And India has the basic demand for this because as several studies, including one by JP Morgan, show that the world of mobility has already been saturated in America. It's already been saturated in Europe. It's been saturated because the process of urbanization in America, when America urbanized, land, gas, and water were cheaply available. And because they were cheaply available, America actually made, you could live in New Jersey, guzzle gas. They created big, big limousines. You could guzzle gas and travel to New York City. They created cities like Atlanta, where 99.8% of the people travel only by cars and only by limousines. Nobody cycles, nobody walks, nobody goes by public transportation. So the American cities were designed for cars and not for people. And the American cities were the biggest guzzlers of gas. And therefore, when India's process of urbanization has just begun, the process of urbanization has ended across America, it's ended across Europe, it's nearing its completion in China, in India has just begun. And we will now do more urbanization in the next 5 decades than what we've done in the last 5,000 years. And therefore, as we start our urbanization, it's very, very important that we do innovative and sustainable urbanization, and it's on the back of public transportation. Not on the back of four-wheelers, but on the back of public transportation. And the key is to embed your cities with public transportation. And the best form of public transportation is our buses, because they are cheap. And cities like Curitiba established that it's possible to build an urban form, compact, dense urban form, where you can get a bus within 2 minutes of walking. Every individual can get a bus in 2 minutes. And therefore, the challenge for India will be not about two-wheelers, not about three-wheelers. but it'll be that how do you transit away from four-wheelers into public mode of transportation. And in the coming years, the challenge will be how do you do public transportation within city and from city to city, and how do you transport your goods from city to city. And there the challenge really is about pushing for CNG within city and LNG from city to city, and in the long run, push for hydrogen as a fuel over a period of time. And to my mind, the ultimate solution is not lithium ion, but in the long term, the solution may be hydrogen, especially for public transportation. And therefore, the challenge is really about public transportation. I have no doubt in my mind that the initial cost of ownership of three-wheelers has become cheaper. 2 years' time, two-wheelers will become cheaper. But India's urbanization process must push for public transportation. And that must be based initially on CNG within cities and within LNG, largely LNG from city to city and for public transportation. And therefore, we are pushing through FAME 2. What is FAME 2? FAME 2, what are we saying? That we should push for public transportation. We are not supporting individual cars. We are supporting a large number of electric buses to municipalities in 64 cities. We are ensuring that India pushes for public transportation in a big way. And over a period of time, we envisage that many of these cities will actually absorb public transportation, which is which will push for sharing, which will push for connected, and which will push for a zero-emission world of the future. So, ladies and gentlemen, my view is that India is in the midst of one of the biggest disruptions that is going to take place, whether we like it or not. Quite often, intellectuals, academicians, civil servants, and the industry is not able to discern the trend. And I think we are in the midst of a very radical transformation where we must understand that if we do not get into the manufacturing of electric vehicle, India would have lost a huge base of manufacturing, which has been one of the key drivers of its industrial growth and job creation. And therefore, it's important to get the size and scale which only India can afford. I mean, India has the capacity to provide size and scale which no other country in the world can do. And therefore, Indian industry must be the biggest driver of this chain of switching over towards a movement from 2,000 parts to 20 parts, moving over to digitization and moving over to electronic parts. And that will really make India the center for manufacturing of the EV world, not merely for India, but for the rest of the world. And that is, to my mind, the real challenge for India. So two key challenges. One is how do you do a new form of urbanization, which is based on public transportation, which is based on a shared, connected, and a zero-emission world, and how do you ensure that the manufacturing of tomorrow, India doesn't lose out and becomes the manufacturer, the global manufacturer for the EV world of tomorrow. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.